Let's bring in our friend Stephen Yates at Yates Comes on Twitter, senior fellow at American First Policy Institute, and he is the chair of the China Policy Initiative. Stephen, good to see you. I'm going to go right into it because I'm very excited about this. Philippines' new leader, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., tears up $5 billion railways deal with China, Belt and Road, after Beijing failed to put up the money. Manila is reported to have ended this transport deal after Beijing failed to act on funding requests. That's a direct quote, apparently, from their media on this. They said the new president is going to seek cash from other nations. 3 major railway projects are now almost $5 billion short. Investors are needed. But Beijing insists, no, the China-Philippines cooperation over railways will continue. Doesn't seem like it. Tell us about this.
Well, it's just friendly, neighborly relations. And you just need to understand that the Chinese mean well. They're just, they're out there to help you out, either to trap you in debt and destroy your country like Sri Lanka, or to promise some big things like railways. No one uses railways, especially in crowded cities and getting around rural countryside areas. So this is just a perfect example of learning what a real reliable partner is. And it turns out that Beijing isn't one of those.
Yeah, it just amazes me that they would why did they let this drop?
Yeah, well, it is crazy because, China is having a harder time economically than is widely advertised, but they're not this cash strapped. And so clearly it's just a matter of allocating priorities. And right now they'd rather spend their money on threatening war against Taiwan and claiming wide swaths of the South China Sea and other kinds of fun things, even including helping the Russians militarily with their invasion of Ukraine. These things cost money, so the Philippines is just going to have to wait.
Yeah, and we're talking with Stephen Yates because it doesn't, it seems like China still thinks the relationship is ongoing, but how certain is it that they are done, that under Philippines' new leader, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., that they are finished with this and not going back?
Well, it's a very heartening line of reasoning by the new leader. Unfortunately, for some of us who've lived with decades of interaction with the Philippines, it's a little bit of a now you see it, now you don't kind of relationship, whether you're an ally or not an ally. Some things can work fantastic until they don't. And so there's two sides to this, but the very obvious part that I think is the dominant variable is that Beijing isn't a reliable partner. And it's a nice wake-up call for others in Southeast Asia to say, Beijing will promise things, but when push comes to shove, they'll gladly throw you under the bus, sell you out, pick your bad analogy, and that's all going to fall to you. And if you happen to be an elected leader, guess what? Your people are going to hold you accountable.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's a very good point. The investments, who are some of the other people who could step up to fill this financial hole? Or countries?
Well, there are many. Japan is the largest investor in humanitarian and infrastructure and other kinds of development projects across Asia. It often has taken an understated approach to that, usually because it's the politics of World War II that people try to hold over them. But Japan is the largest investor in Indonesia, and presumably it has no small investments in the Philippines. I'm sure the United States has some investments there. The U.S. is kind of tapped out these days on aid projects and filling other people's buckets. So I wouldn't recommend any ally looking to the United States first for these kinds of things. But India, Japan, Australia, others in Southeast Asia, all options, the Koreans too. But people are just learning the hard way. Some of us have said all along, but they're learning the hard way that we were right all along. Don't rely on the Chinese approach. Everyone else that's not in that web work together because that's ultimately going to be more sustainable, even if it might be more expensive up front.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Well, and you mentioned, too, Sri Lanka, the Wall Street Journal headline from them just a couple of days ago. The debt crisis tests, this is interesting, China's role as financier to poor countries. Developing world faces a credit crunch, but the biggest lender of all has been slow to cooperate with Western-style rescues, which I think is an ungenerous term. But this... essentially from what I understand, China was telling Sri Lanka, go ahead and skip the IMF, skip their medicine for now, and just, keep adding to your debt. You can just deal with it all later. Apparently that's, according to Sri Lankan officials, that's what they've been told by China.
Well, if you've been in China and the world's literati has just showered you in unearned money for decades, how can you blame them for thinking that this is just the way the world works? We make up our own statistics. We do or don't complete projects, some of which collapse, but the world will keep showering money on us. And why can't other people just develop this way? And so, we can't completely blame the Chinese for having been on international globalist welfare for 3 decades, that they don't quite understand markets or responsibility. And shame on anyone who thought that they were going to uphold any kind of principles of reform and accountability. They don't practice it themselves. How in the world do we expect that their involvement is going to do anything like what the IMF programs say they aim to do?
Exactly. It seems like their Belt and Road Initiative is taking some hits.
Yeah, they have for some time. I think the hits are getting bigger. But this is what happens, though. I mean, it takes time for people to see that this stuff doesn't work. I mean, all across the continent of Africa, there are stadiums that were built and politicians that celebrated those stadiums, and they're supposed to last a generation. It turns out they last 5 years or so. A crack forms in the foundation. A road or a bridge is built. It's compromised. They don't get the jobs from the projects. People just have to learn from sad experience. But I think that the chickens are coming home to roost a bit on this. And China has its own problems. They have their own mega developments that are financially and physically collapsing these days.
Exactly. We're talking with Stephen Yates, who also worked in the Bush White House. He was advising the former VP Dick Cheney on foreign policy issues. I want to switch gears and ask you, before we let you go, of course, about the president's trip, first to Israel, then to Saudi Arabia. Honestly, the only thing that I see reported about his trip was gaffes. That's it. What was accomplished?
Well, it was the fist bump heard round the world. So there's an over-obsession with a form of greeting, and is it too palsy and whatever else. And so congratulations yet again to the World Record Communications team and strategic advisory group around the president. It was a great, great decision that they made to postpone this trip so they could have an extra month to get everything right. So that you don't say that the Holocaust is an honor or a horror, or, fuss around about whether I think, not great guy should or shouldn't have been murdered, and do we need to talk about oil prices? So this was just a dog's breakfast to begin with. And all the president and his team did was make it worse. I mean, I think this to date is the summation of the Biden presidency. All he'd had to do was shut up, show up, and do nothing, and America would be sailing today.
Yeah,
and it's the only thing they've added are gaffes, offenses, bungles, and just general weirdness.
Yeah,
I think the Saudis came away somewhat laughing at our leader, and who's to say they're wrong?
He looked so weak when I saw the one. I don't think it was in Jeddah. I think it's when he arrived in Israel and he got off the plane and he was standing there on the little red carpet on the tarmac, and he didn't know where to go, and everyone else there, including the leaders, knew where to point him to. And then when he shuffled over there, it was bad. Everyone's talking about the gaffes, but you know what? I think that sometimes the media, even they help him out in certain respects by focusing on that. The more cosmetic gaffes, like the stuff that he flubs when he's speaking, because then they would have to report on, the selling of millions of barrels of SPR to Beijing, essentially, and asking how much money the Bidens have been making in collusion with the communist Chinese government off of selling our oil from our strategic reserves.
Yeah, I can't imagine why they don't want to face those questions. They've been so good at taking accountability. I think there's been a record number of press avails by the president so far. Just ask his team, they'll tell you. But there were significant policy misses on this trip that matter. How to deal with Iran in its current state is a serious issue for all of our allies in that region and beyond. It was a major, major issue in dealing with our ally Israel. It was a major issue in dealing with the Saudis and the Gulf Coast allies that have been sort of a ballast, where they're stepping forward and dealing with a bit more of their security. And they are the ones that feel like they're first in line at risk from extremism and terrorism from Iran. And so to not really have a clear and reassuring message to them, how do you then go ask them for a favor if you're leaving their neighborhood in such a bad situation? But the air handshake to no one is symbolic of what they're doing on substance. It was painful to watch the president being asked a question in a joint press avail with a major leader, and the major leader has to remind the president, this question was for you, Mr. President, and he has to refer to his list, which has no connection to who's asking and what the topic is. We've never had a modern leader of the United States like this, and those might be the outward things that people want to snatch onto, but you can't expect that the deep substance is going any better.
No, you can't. Oh, just a mess all the way around. Stephen Yates at YatesComs on Twitter. You can go and follow him and get his insights. Stephen, always a pleasure to see you. Thank you, my friend. Good to talk with you.
Thank you, Dana. Take care.
Of course, you too.